Show me the tattoo and I'll let go. The fabric tore. Not all the way. Just enough to pull her shoulder seam down and expose her arm in front of the whole diner. There it was, an anchor, wrapped in a trident, faded, 15 years old. The biker laughed. Little Waitress got herself a big boy tattoo. You buy that at some tourist shop. Nobody moved. Not the truckers by the window, not the nurses in the corner. But at the counter, an old Navy man went completely still, coffee halfway to his lips, because he had seen that exact design before. A long time ago, on someone else's arm. The waitress pulled her collar back into place. She looked the man dead in the eye. You still have a chance to walk it back, she said. He should have listened. Because in 4 days that quiet woman was reporting for duty. And the medals on his jacket, he never earned a single one.
Some mornings start out ordinary and end up changing a town forever. This is one of those stories. If you've ever worked a job where people looked right through you, where they treated you like furniture instead of a person, stay with us a while. This one's for you. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room has carried more weight than anyone around her will ever know. Her name was Marlowe Whitfield. She was 33 years old, and on the morning this story begins, nobody in that little diner knew what she carried under her sleeve. By the end of the day, they would. Let's begin. The sun hadn't cleared the water tower yet when Marlowe unlocked the back door of the diner. It was 5:45 in the morning. The air smelled like last night's rain on warm pavement. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice, then went quiet. She flipped on the lights. One by one, the old fluorescent tubes buzzed awake over the counter. She'd worked at this place for almost 3 years now. It was called the Copper Spoon, and it sat on Main Street in a town called Cedar Falls, the kind of place where everybody waved at everybody, and the diner had been open longer than most of its customers had been alive. 3 years was long enough to learn things. Which booth wobbled, which regulars liked their eggs runny, and which ones would send them back if they were. Long enough to know that Harold Jennings took his coffee black, no cream, and liked it waiting on the counter before he even sat down. Long enough to know the rhythm of small-town mornings, and to love that rhythm more than she ever expected to. She moved through after her routine without thinking much about it. Start the coffee, wipe the counters, flip the sign on the door from closed to open. Simple work, honest work. There was something in it Marlowe had come to depend on. It asked nothing of her that she couldn't give. It didn't ask about her past, and it didn't ask what she carried on her skin, hidden under long sleeves even in the thick of August. Nobody at the Copper Spoon knew much about her past the basics. She was polite, she worked hard, she never missed a shift, never complained, and always had a kind word ready for the old-timers who came in just to have somewhere warm to sit. For most people in this town, that had always been enough. By 6:15, the first regular walked through the door. Harold Jennings was 78 years old, and he moved the way a man moves when he spent a lifetime being careful with his knees. He wore a faded blue jacket with a small eagle stitched over the chest, the fabric gone soft from years of washing. "Morning, Marlowe," he said, easing onto his usual stool. "Morning, Hal." She was already pouring his coffee before he finished sitting. "Sleep all right?" "About as good as a man my age sleeps." He wrapped both hands around the mug like it was keeping him warm from the inside out. "Which is to say, not much." She smiled at that. It was the same joke more or less every single morning, but there was comfort in the repetition. A kind of steadiness that neither of them ever talked about directly. Hal had been a Navy man once, decades back. He never said much about it. A comment about discipline here, a turn of phrase there that sounded like it belonged on the deck of a ship instead of a diner stool. Marlowe never pushed him to say more, and he never once asked why she kept her sleeves down, even in the worst of the summer heat. Some people understand each other just fine without needing the whole story. By 7, the place had filled up the way it always did on a weekday morning. Truckers heading out early, a couple of nurses coming off the night shift at the county hospital. Diane Kowalski moved between the register and the kitchen like she'd done it her whole life. She had. 20 years running this diner, and it showed in the way she carried herself, quick and sure, never wasting a step. Diane was 55. sharp-tongued and softer-hearted than she liked anyone to notice. She'd hired Marlowe on a whim 3 years back, mostly because something in the young woman's eyes had told her this was somebody who needed steady ground under her feet. Diane never pried. She'd simply handed her the job, then more responsibility, then over time something close to trust. The Copper Spoon had been a fixture on Main Street since before Diane's own mother ran the register, back when Cedar Falls still had a working railroad depot and half the town clocked in at the old mill down by the river. The mill had closed years ago. The depot sat boarded up, now weeds growing up through the platform. But the diner had held on, the way certain places do, becoming less a business and more a kind of anchor for the people who still called this town home. Regulars came and went with the seasons, farmers in for early breakfast before the fields needed them, retirees who'd nowhere better to be and no interest in being anywhere else, a scattering of young families who still believed, despite everything, that a small town like this one was worth staying in. Marlowe had come to know most of them by name inside her first month on the job. It was easier that way, she'd found. Easier to disappear into a place where everybody had somewhere to be and something to say, where nobody thought twice about a quiet young woman who kept mostly to herself and never talked about where she'd come from. "Table 6 needs their check," Diane called from behind the register. "On it," Marlowe answered, already moving. It was an ordinary morning, ordinary in every single way, which is exactly why nobody in that diner was ready for what happened at 11:15 when the low growl of engines rolled down Main Street and stopped right outside the front window. There's a sound a motorcycle makes when it wants to be noticed. Not the sound of somebody riding to work, or riding home, or riding just because they love the open road. This was different, built for attention, built to announce trouble before it ever walked through the door. 5 bikes pulled up outside the Copper Spoon, engines idling loud enough to rattle the front glass. Diane looked up from the register with a small frown. She'd seen this crew pass through before a handful of times over the years. Never good news when they stopped. The bell over the door jingled, and this time it sounded sharper, somehow, like even the bell knew what was coming. 5 men walked in, leather jackets, patches sewn across their backs, reading "Iron Serpents," boots that hit the floor heavy the way boots do when a man wants everyone in the room to hear each step. At the front of the group walked a man who carried himself like he owned every room he entered. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, built like he'd spent years working with his hands, or maybe just years working out his temper. His jacket carried different patches than the others, military ones, a row of medals pinned along the chest catching the light off the front window. His name was Griff Colton, though most people just called him Reaper. In Cedar Falls, that name carried a certain weight, a respect built up over the years by people who assumed he'd earned it. The Iron Serpents rolled through this stretch of the county every couple of months, on their way to somewhere else, never staying long enough for anybody to ask too many questions. They weren't outlaws, exactly, just men who'd built a life around leather and loud engines and old grievances nobody outside the club fully understood. Griff had led them for almost a decade now, ever since the previous president had gotten too old to ride and handed the reins over without much ceremony. Leading them had given Griff something he'd never quite managed to find on his own. Purpose of a kind. A room that went quiet when he walked into it. A story about his father that men twice his size were willing to nod along to out of respect for something they assumed ran deeper than it did. "Well, would you look at this place?" Griff said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Still standing, huh?" A couple of regulars glanced up, then dropped their eyes back to their plates. That was the thing about men like Griff. People learned fast not to hold his gaze. But not everyone looked away. Hal kept his eyes right where they were, steady on his coffee, though his shoulders had gone just slightly rigid. The stillness of a man who'd learned a long time ago to read a room before it turned dangerous. Diane forced a smile onto her face, the kind that had worn thin over the years but never fully disappeared. "Table for 5?" she asked. "We'll take the big booth in back," Griff said, already walking past her, "and send over the pretty one, the blonde." He meant Marlowe. She was refilling coffee 2 tables over, and she heard every word clear as a bell. She didn't flinch. Didn't look up right away. Just finished pouring the cup in front of her, set the pot down gently, and turned toward the back booth like it was any table in the room. Because to her, right then, it was. She had no idea yet how wrong that would turn out to be. "What can I get you boys?" she asked, notepad ready, her voice even and pleasant. Griff leaned back in the booth, looking her over slow, the kind of look that made his companions chuckle low under their breath. "Depends what's on the menu, sweetheart," he said. One of the others, a heavy-set man with a scar cutting through his eyebrow, laughed a beat too loud. Marlowe didn't smile. Didn't scowl, either. Her face held the same calm professional line she'd worn for difficult customers 100 times before. "Breakfast special runs till 11:30, she said. "Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee included." Griff studied her a long moment. Something about the way she carried herself needled at him, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Maybe it was that she wasn't scared of him. Men like Griff built their whole identity out of other people's fear. When somebody failed to give him that reaction, it itched at something underneath all that leather and all those patches. "5 specials, he said finally. "Don't skimp on the bacon. We're hungry men." "Coming right up." She turned to go, and that's when he added, loud enough to carry across the whole room, "Careful with that one, boys. Looks like she thinks she's tough." More laughter rolled out of the booth. Marlowe kept walking, didn't turn around. She'd learned a long time ago that the loudest men in any room were rarely the ones worth paying attention to. For the next 20 minutes, things stayed quiet enough. The Iron Serpents talked among themselves, occasionally raised their voices, just to remind the diner they were there. Marlowe refilled their coffee twice without complaint, cleared a few plates, kept the same steady rhythm she kept for every table in the house. It should have ended there. A loud booth, a few uncomfortable minutes, then 5 men climbing back onto their bikes and riding off toward wherever they'd come from. It didn't end there, because Griff had noticed something. Every time Marlowe reached across the table to top off a cup, her sleeve shifted just slightly, revealing a thin sliver of skin at her wrist. And on that sliver, barely visible, sat the edge of something dark. A tattoo. Griff had grown up around men who took ink seriously, men who'd earned certain marks the hard way, and men who bought fake respect with symbols they had no right to wear. He didn't know which kind she was, but not knowing bothered him more than it should have. "Hey," he said the next time she passed the booth. "What's that on your arm?" Marlowe paused for half a second, just half. "Nothing important," she said, reaching for his empty plate. Griff caught her wrist before she could pull it back. Not hard, not violent, not yet, but firm enough that the whole booth went quiet, watching. "Didn't look like nothing," he said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "Let's see it." The diner had gone still. Diane felt her stomach drop the moment she saw his hand close around Marlowe's wrist. She started moving from behind the counter, but Marlowe's eyes flicked toward her just for a second, and something in that look said, "Stay back." Not because Marlowe was afraid, because she didn't want anybody else pulled into this. "Let go of my wrist," she said. Her voice hadn't risen at all, steady, calm, almost gentle. But there was something underneath it now, something with an edge to it. Griff smiled, the kind of smile with nothing warm behind it. "Or what?" he said. The whole diner had gone silent now. Forks stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the nurses at the corner table turned to watch. Marlowe held his gaze a long moment. "Or nothing," she said finally. "I'm just asking you to let go, that's all it is." Something in the way she said it made a few people in that diner feel a chill they couldn't quite explain. Not a threat, not a plea, just a plain statement of fact delivered with a calm that didn't belong in that moment. Griff let go. Not because he wanted to, because for one strange second something behind her eyes made him hesitate. And Griff Colton was not a man used to hesitating. He covered it fast with a laugh, turning back to his crew. "Feisty one, huh?" Marlowe picked up the plate she'd been reaching for and walked off without another word. For just a moment she thought it was over. She was wrong. It happened 5 minutes later when she came back to drop the check. Griff had been drinking, not much, but enough to loosen whatever restraint he'd shown before. He was talking louder now, spinning some story to his crew about a bar fight from years back, embellishing every detail the way men like him always do. When Marlowe set the check on the table, he reached out and grabbed her arm again, harder this time. "Not so fast," he said. "I asked you a question." "What's that tattoo? Please let go," she said, and this time there was something firmer under the calm. "Come on now." His voice had picked up an edge of cruelty, the kind that surfaces when a man wants an audience to watch him win. "You wearing something you got no business wearing, trying to look tough for the customers? Let go of my arm, show me the tattoo, and I'll let go." What happened next took under 2 seconds. Griff's other hand shot out and grabbed the collar of her uniform shirt. Whether he meant to finish what came after, or whether it was just the clumsy violence of a man who'd had 1 drink too many and 1 ounce too much pride, nobody in that diner would ever be entirely sure. The fabric tore. Not all the way, just enough. Enough to pull her shoulder seam down and expose her upper arm and part of her collarbone in front of the whole room. And there, plain under the fluorescent light, sat a tattoo. An anchor wrapped in a trident, the ink faded a little with age, but still clear, still unmistakably a symbol that meant something. For a moment, nobody said a word. Griff stared at it, then started to laugh. It wasn't a kind laugh, it was the laugh of a man covering his own surprise with mockery, the way bullies have done since bullies first existed. "Well, would you look at that," he said loud enough for every table to hear. "Little Waitress got herself a big boy tattoo." "What is that, sweetheart? You buy that at some tourist shop, trying to look like something you're not?" His crew laughed along, though a couple of them looked less sure of themselves than he did. Marlowe stood there a moment, one hand pulling her torn collar back into place, her face unreadable. The whole diner watched a grown man mock a woman half his size over ink she'd carried quietly under her sleeve for 15 years. Nobody said a word. Not the truckers by the window, not the nurses in the corner, not even Diane frozen behind the register, torn between rushing over and some quiet instinct telling her this wasn't a moment for rushing. Marlowe finished tucking her shirt back into place. Then she looked Griff dead in the eye and said something that would echo through that diner for a long, long time after. "You still have a chance to walk it back." That was it. 9 words, delivered without anger, without fear, without a single raised syllable. Griff blinked, caught off guard by how strange the sentence sounded coming from someone he'd expected to cry or run or beg. "Walk what back?" he said, trying to sound amused. "You threatening me, sweetheart?"
"No," she said. "I'm giving you an out."
Without waiting for an answer, she turned and walked toward the kitchen. She didn't run, didn't hurry, just walked at her normal pace through the swinging door and let it close behind her. For a few seconds after she disappeared, the diner sat frozen in the kind of silence that follows something nobody quite understands yet. Griff sat back in the booth, trying to shake off the odd feeling settling over him. He glanced at his crew, looking for the reassurance of shared laughter, but found only uneasy glances instead. "What's her deal?" one of the bikers muttered. Griff shrugged, too proud to admit those 9 words had actually rattled him. "Who cares? Probably some fake ink she got in college to feel edgy." Even as he said it, some part of him wasn't sure he believed it. He'd seen plenty of tattoos in his life, fake ones, real ones, ones bought for looks, and ones earned the hard way. And something about the placement of that ink, the small details worked into the design, hadn't looked like tourist shop work. He pushed the thought away and reached for his coffee instead. Across the room, at the counter, Harold Jennings hadn't moved a muscle through the whole thing. He'd sat perfectly still, coffee halfway to his lips, eyes locked on that tattoo the entire time it was visible. His hand was shaking now, just slightly, because Hal had seen that exact design before, a long time ago. Not on Marlowe's arm, on someone else's. Back in the kitchen, Marlowe leaned against the stainless counter and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands weren't shaking. They rarely did anymore. Years of practice had taught her how to keep them steady even when everything underneath felt anything but calm. Diane pushed through the swinging door a moment later, face tight with worry.
Marlowe? Honey, are you all right? I'm fine, Diane. That man just tore your shirt in front of the whole diner. I know.
She pulled a spare apron off the hook by the cooler and tied it over her shoulder, covering the torn seam as best she could.
I've had worse.
Diane studied her a long moment. Something in Marlowe's voice, something too calm, too practiced, told her this wasn't the first time this young woman had learned to swallow something painful and just keep moving. "You want to head home for the day?" Diane asked gently. "I'll cover the rest of your shift." Marlowe shook her head. "No, I'm all right, really. You don't have to be tough all the time, you know." Marlowe glanced up at her, and for one flicker of a moment, something old and tired crossed her face. "I'm not being tough," she said quietly. "I'm just used to it." Diane let it sit. She'd learned over 3 years of working beside this young woman that some doors don't open just because you knock politely. Some open only when the person on the other side decides it's time. "All right," Diane said, instead squeezing her hand. "But if that man says one more word to you, I'm calling Sheriff Boone myself." Marlowe managed a small smile. "Deal." Out front, the tension settled into an uneasy quiet. Griff and his crew finished eating, though the mood at their booth had shifted, gone sour in a way none of them wanted to name out loud. When Griff finally stood to leave, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the table, he paused near the counter where Hal still sat. "Something wrong, old-timer?" he asked, catching the way the older man was watching him. Hal met his eyes evenly, nothing aggressive in his face, just a quiet, steady kind of attention that made Griff feel for just a second strangely exposed. "Not a thing," Hal said, "just thinking about how a man wearing another man's medals ought to be more careful who he mocks." The words landed soft, almost conversational, but they cut deeper than Griff expected. "Excuse me," his voice had picked up an edge. "Nothing," Hal said, turning back to his coffee. "Enjoy your ride, son." Griff stood there a moment, unsure whether he'd just been insulted or imagined the whole thing. But something in the old man's calm certainty left him uneasy in a way he couldn't name. He grabbed his jacket and walked out without another word, his crew trailing behind him, the bell jingling one last time as the door swung shut. A moment later, 5 engines roared to life outside and the sound faded slowly down Main Street until the diner sat quiet again. The rest of the lunch rush passed in something close to normal, though the whole place seemed to move a little slower, a little quieter than usual. Word had already started to travel. A few regulars who'd missed the scene themselves heard about it secondhand, and by 2 that afternoon, half the town seemed to know something strange had happened at the Copper Spoon that morning. None of them knew the real story yet. None of them knew the anchor-and-trident tattooed on Marlowe Whitfield's arm wasn't something she'd bought on a whim. None of them knew what it had cost her to get it. And none of them knew that 15 years earlier, on the day she turned 18, she'd walked into a small tattoo shop 3 states away and asked for that exact design in that exact spot, because it was the only way she knew how to keep a promise to somebody she'd loved and lost. It was nearly 3 that afternoon when Hal finally worked up the nerve to say something. The diner had emptied out for the slow stretch between lunch and dinner. Marlowe was wiping down the counter near his stool, her torn shirt hidden beneath the borrowed apron. Her movements steady and unhurried, as always. "Marlowe?" Hal said quietly. She looked up. "Yeah, Hal." He hesitated, weathered hands wrapped around his empty cup like he needed something to hold on to. "That tattoo," he said finally. "The one on your arm." Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture went still. "What about it?" He chose his next words with care, the way a man does when he's about to step onto ground he isn't sure will hold his weight. "I've seen that design before," he said. "A long time ago. On somebody else." The words sat in the air between them. Marlowe set down her rag slowly. "That's a common design, Hal," she said, her voice carefully flat. Plenty of people have it. Not with that exact detail, he said, not with the small marking underneath the trident. Most folks wouldn't even notice it unless they knew to look. Marlowe went very quiet. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The diner sat around them in the late afternoon hush sunlight slanting through the front windows, dust drifting lazily through the beams. I served 31 years, Hal said softly. Retired a lieutenant commander, spent some of that time around men who wore that exact mark, men who earned it the hard way. Her eyes had gone glassy, though she blinked it back fast. You're not wrong, she said finally, barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly like a man who'd just had a suspicion confirmed that he wished hadn't been. Whose was it? He asked gently. Before it was yours. She looked down at her arm, at the apron covering the ink underneath. For 15 years she'd answered questions about that tattoo with silence or vague half-truths, or by simply changing the subject until people gave up asking. But something about the way Hal had asked, quiet and respectful, carrying a kind of understanding she rarely came across, made the old walls feel a little less necessary. My father's, she said finally. Hal's breath caught just slightly. He was a Navy man, she went on, her voice steady even as her eyes weren't. Chief petty officer, served for years before I was even born. When I was 12, he died in a training accident, a night jump that went wrong. The words came out plain, without drama, the way facts do when a person has carried them so long they've become part of the furniture of a life. Hal sat very still, listening. I got this tattoo when I turned 18, she said. Same design he wore. Felt like the only way I knew how to keep him close. For a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. Then he reached out and laid his weathered hand gently over hers on the counter. 21 years, he said quietly. You've carried that a long time, young lady. She managed a small, tired smile. Feels longer, some days. I imagine it does. Outside, the light had started turning gold, the way it always did this time of afternoon, spilling long shadows across Main Street. Inside the Copper Spoon, an old sailor and a young woman sat together in the quiet, sharing a piece of a story that had waited a very long time to find someone willing to listen. Hal didn't ask anything further that afternoon. He seemed to understand the way men of his generation often did, that some stories arrive in pieces offered only when the person carrying them is finally ready to set part of the weight down. But something had shifted between them. Before that day, Hal had simply been a kind old regular who tipped well and always said please and thank you. Now he felt like something closer to a keeper of a secret Marlowe had carried alone for far too long. I won't tell anyone, he said quietly as she refilled his coffee one last time before his usual 3:30 departure. Not unless you want me to. I know, she said, and meant it. There was something in his steadiness and the careful way he'd handled the conversation that told her this was a man who understood the weight of trust. He stood slowly, joints protesting a lifetime of use, and left a few extra dollars on the counter, same as always. You take care of yourself, Marlowe, he said, and you let me know if that man comes back around here. I will. He paused at the door, looking back at her a long moment. Your father, he said quietly. Whoever he was, he'd be proud of the woman standing in front of me right now. He didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded once, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the golden afternoon light, the bell jingling softly behind him. Marlowe stood behind the counter a long moment after he left, one hand resting lightly over the torn shoulder of her shirt, hidden now beneath the apron. 15 years she'd kept this quiet. 15 years of long sleeves in the summer heat, careful answers, changing the subject the second anyone asked about the mark on her arm. In the space of a single afternoon, in the space of one torn shirt and one gentle old man's careful questions, some small piece of that silence had finally started to crack. She didn't know it yet, standing there as the afternoon light shifted toward evening, but that crack was only the beginning. That night after closing, Marlowe sat alone in her small apartment above the hardware store 2 blocks from the diner. She'd changed out of her torn uniform hours ago, but found herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror anyway, sleeve pushed up, looking at the tattoo the way she rarely let herself anymore. The anchor, the trident, the small marking underneath, worn soft with age, the one most people never noticed unless they knew exactly what to look for. Her father had worn this same design on his own arm for reasons he'd never fully explained when she was young enough to ask without understanding. She only came to understand it later, much later, after he was already gone. She remembered him the way children remember parents who leave too soon. Fragments more than full memories. The sound of his laugh, the way he used to lift her onto his shoulders in the backyard, pointing out constellations he'd learned to navigate by back before satellites made it easy. She remembered the funeral more clearly than she wanted to. The folded flag, the careful, practiced condolences of men in uniform who hadn't quite known what to say to a 12-year-old girl who'd just lost her whole world. And she remembered, 6 years later, walking into that tattoo shop on her 18th birthday, 3 states from the small town where she'd grown up, asking the artist to recreate the exact design from an old photograph of her father, taken years before she was even born. It had taken 4 hours. She hadn't made a sound the entire time. Some pain, she'd learned, was worth carrying quietly. Tomorrow she had 4 days left before she reported for duty herself. 4 days before she left Cedar Falls behind, at least for a while, to begin the training that would make her a Navy hospital corpsman, the branch of service where a person could stand beside soldiers in the field and hold them together, body and spirit both, when everything else was falling apart. Nobody at the diner knew that part yet either. She'd planned to keep it that way, slip out quiet, skip the questions, the fuss, the attention. She'd pictured it 100 times, working her final shift like any other, saying her goodbyes in small, ordinary ways, and driving off before anybody had the chance to make more of it than she wanted them to. But something about today had cracked that plan wide open too. She thought about Griff's laughter, the way he'd mocked something he had no understanding of at all. She thought about the medals pinned to his jacket, medals that had looked, now that she considered it, a little too clean, a little too uniform, like they'd all come from the same box rather than been earned across years of different postings. That thought nagged at her, though she couldn't yet say why. She closed her eyes and let the sleeve fall back down over her arm, covering the ink the way she'd covered it for 15 years. Tomorrow was another day at the diner. Another day of coffee refills and quiet routines. She had no idea yet how much that routine was about to change. Across town, in a garage behind a rundown bar on the edge of Cedar Falls, Griff Colton sat on an overturned crate, a beer in his hand, staring at nothing in particular. His crew had gone home hours ago, but he'd stayed behind, unable to shake the strange unease that had followed him since that afternoon at the diner. He kept circling back to the tattoo, to the old man's quiet comment near the counter, the one that had landed sharper than he wanted to admit. A man wearing another man's medals ought to be more careful who he mocks. He took a long pull off his beer, trying to push the thought away. The medals had been his father's, or so he'd always been told, passed down along with stories, so many stories about the man's service, his sacrifice, the years he'd given defending a country that never fully appreciated him. Griff had built his whole identity on those stories. The Iron Serpents respected him because of them. Half this town, at least the parts that didn't know better, respected him because of them too. He wore his father's legacy like armor because it was easier than facing the truth that his own life had never amounted to much on its own. He didn't know it yet, sitting alone in that garage with his beer going warm in his hand, how thin that armor really was. He didn't know that 21 years ago, on a night that had nothing to do with him, something had happened that would eventually tear his whole understanding of his father apart. He only knew that a quiet waitress with a tattoo she'd refused to explain had rattled something loose inside him that he couldn't quite name. And somewhere underneath the anger and the wounded pride, an unfamiliar feeling had started to take root. Doubt. The next morning, Cedar Falls woke up the way it always did, Slow and unhurried mist curling off the river at the edge of town, the shops along Main Street opening their doors one by one. Something had shifted quietly, invisibly in the fabric of the town overnight. Hal had gone home the evening before and told his wife in careful, measured words about the young waitress and the tattoo and the story she'd finally shared with him. His wife, a retired schoolteacher named Ruth, listened with growing sadness and growing respect, and gently suggested it might be time somebody in this town started paying closer attention to who was wearing real honor and who was simply borrowing its shape. And somewhere on the edge of town, in that same run-down garage, Griff woke up with a headache and an unfamiliar weight sitting in his chest, the kind of weight that settles in when the story a man's told himself his whole life starts to feel a little less solid than it used to. None of them knew it yet, but the quiet events of that ordinary morning had set something in motion. A thread had been pulled, and in a town where everybody knew everybody, threads like that had a way of unraveling further than anyone expected. Marlowe spent the next morning much like the one before, pouring coffee, taking orders, moving through her routine with the same steady calm she always carried. But there was something different in the air of the Copper Spoon that day. A few more glances her way than usual, a few quiet conversations that stopped when she walked past. Word had spread further than she realized. Around 10, Diane pulled her aside near the walk-in cooler, her expression thoughtful. "People are talking," Diane said, "about yesterday, about the tattoo." Marlowe sighed. "Figured they might." "You don't have to explain anything to anybody," Diane said firmly. "This is still your business and nobody else's." "I know." Marlowe managed a small, tired smile. "But I think some things have a way of coming out whether you plan for it or not." Diane studied her a moment, something soft in her face. "Your father," she said carefully. "Hal mentioned a little last night when he called to check on things. Said he served?" Marlowe nodded once. "He did." "I'm sorry you lost him so young." "Me too." A pause settled between them, the comfortable kind that only comes from people who trust each other. "For what it's worth," Diane said finally, "whatever that tattoo means, whatever it cost you, I think it's about time this town understood what real honor actually looks like. Because lately it seems like the loudest folks wearing the biggest medals are the ones who understand it least." Marlowe looked up at her, surprised by the quiet fierceness in Diane's voice. "You've noticed that too," she said. "Honey, I've run this diner 20 years. I've watched a lot of people walk through that door. You learn pretty quick who's carrying something real and who's just carrying a costume." She reached out and squeezed Marlowe's shoulder. "4 more days," Diane said. "Then you're off to serve this country the same way your daddy did. I think it's about time this town knew exactly who's been pouring their coffee the past 3 years. Marlowe felt something tighten in her chest, equal parts fear and relief. She wasn't ready for the whole town to know, but some part of her, tired of silence for longer than she could measure, was starting to feel like maybe it was time. Diane went back to the register and Marlowe carried a fresh pot of coffee out to the far tables, moving through the rest of her shift with the same careful attention she always gave it. Nobody watching her would have guessed at the conversation she'd just had, or the 21 years she carried quietly beneath her uniform. That was the thing about people who'd learned to carry weight without complaint. From the outside, they looked no different from anybody else pouring coffee on an ordinary Tuesday. It was only up close, only if you knew to look, that you noticed the steadiness in their hands came from somewhere deeper than habit. That evening, Marlowe walked home slower than usual. The street lights along Main Street flickered on, one by one, as the sky faded from gold to a soft, bruised purple. Cedar Falls looked almost peaceful in that light, the kind of peaceful that made it easy to forget anything difficult had ever happened here at all. She passed the old war memorial in the town square, a modest stone marker with names etched across it, names of local men and women who'd served over the decades. She'd walked past it 100 times without stopping. Tonight she stopped. She read a few names, slowly, the way a person reads something not for information but just for a moment to breathe. Her father's name wasn't on that stone. He hadn't been from Cedar Falls. He was buried 3 states away in a cemetery she visited twice a year on his birthday and on the anniversary of the night that took him. But standing there in front of names she didn't recognize, she felt something unexpected. A kind of kinship. A quiet understanding that every name on that stone had once belonged to somebody's father, somebody's daughter, somebody who'd carried a weight not everyone around them could see. She thought about the promise she'd made to herself the day she got that tattoo. A promise to carry her father forward quietly, without needing anyone else to understand why. For 15 years, that promise had been enough. Tonight, for the first time, she wondered if it was time to let a few more people in on the reason why. She thought about the 2 officers who'd stood on her mother's porch 21 years ago, hats in hand, faces arranged into the careful blankness of men delivering news they'd delivered too many times before. She thought about her mother's hands and the way they'd never quite stopped trembling afterward, not really, not even years later when she spoke of him at all. She thought about the last morning she'd seen her father alive, the way he'd knelt down in the driveway and told her to keep her chin up no matter what came her way. She hadn't understood at 12 why he'd said it quite like that, with that particular weight behind the words. She understood it better now, standing at a stone marker for men she'd never met in a town that had somehow become the closest thing to home she'd found since. She walked the rest of the way home, the memorial fading behind her in the dark, her own footsteps the only sound on the empty street. 4 days remained. Whatever was coming next, she had a feeling it would arrive long before those 4 days ran out. Somewhere behind her, the lights of Cedar Falls glowed soft against the night sky, steady and unaware, the whole town sleeping through the last quiet hours before everything about to unfold finally began. Some stories start out exactly like that, quiet and unnoticed, right up until the moment they finally, unmistakably, aren't anymore. Some towns keep their secrets buried deep. Cedar Falls was never that kind of town. By the time the sun cleared the water tower the next morning, half of Main Street already knew that something had happened at the Copper Spoon. Not everything, just enough. A torn shirt, a tattoo nobody expected, an old sailor who'd gone quiet at the counter and hadn't quite been the same since. 3 days remained before Marlowe Whitfield was set to leave Cedar Falls, at least for a while, to report for duty and begin the training that would carry her forward into a life her father never got the chance to see her live. She had no idea how much would happen in those 3 days. Neither did anyone else in town. But some mornings carry a weight before they even begin. This was one of them. Eleanor Doyle arrived at the diner earlier than usual that day. She was 67, silver-haired, with the kind of sharp, assessing eyes that made people sit up straighter without quite knowing why. For 30 years, she'd served as a Navy attorney, most of that career spent inside courtrooms most civilians never even knew existed, building cases most people never heard the outcome of. She'd retired to Cedar Falls 8 years back, drawn in by the quiet and the slow, unhurried pace of small-town living. Most mornings, she took the same corner booth, ordered black coffee and rye toast, and read the newspaper until 9, same as always. This morning, she wasn't thinking about the newspaper. She was thinking about medals. She'd seen Griff Colton around town a handful of times over the years, always in that same leather jacket, always with those same pins catching the light. She'd never thought much of it. People wore all kinds of things, and it wasn't her business to wonder why. But something about yesterday's story, the way Griff had mocked a young woman's tattoo while wearing his own medals like a costume, had loosened something in the back of Eleanor's memory, the way an old habit stirs awake when it senses its use is needed again. She sat down in her booth, opened her newspaper out of custom, and never once looked at it. Instead, she found herself cataloging one detail at a time, the small differences that separate real service from borrowed glory. The order ribbons are meant to sit in, the way a man carries himself when a medal actually cost him something, the particular hollowness in a story told by somebody who'd only ever read about the thing they claimed to have lived. By the time Marlowe came around with the coffee pot, Eleanor had made up her mind about something. "Marlowe," she said quietly, "can I ask you something?" Marlowe paused, pot in hand. Of course. That man yesterday, Colton. Have you seen him wear that jacket before? A few times, actually, Marlowe said, thinking. He comes through every couple months. Always the same medals? I think so. Why? Eleanor's eyes narrowed the way they used to narrow decades ago, back when she'd caught the first thread of something worth pulling. No reason, yet, she said. Just an old habit. Spent a career noticing things most folks walk right past. Marlowe studied her a moment, sensing there was more sitting under that answer than Eleanor was letting show. You were Navy too? She asked. Judge Advocate General's Corps, Eleanor said. 30 years. Spent most of it making sure the truth mattered even when powerful men would have preferred it didn't. Something in Marlowe's chest loosened at that. Another person in this town, it seemed, who understood the actual weight of service rather than just the costume of it. Well, she said quietly, if you find anything worth knowing, I'd like to hear it. Eleanor gave a small, determined nod. I suspect you will. 3 towns over, in the garage behind a bar that had seen better decades, Griff Colton sat on an overturned crate, nursing a headache and a pride that hadn't eased since yesterday. His crew had already noticed something was off. He'd been short with all of them since sunrise, snapping at questions he'd normally have laughed straight through. You all right, boss? Asked Dutch, the heavyset one with the scar cutting through his eyebrow. I'm fine, Griff muttered, not looking up from the engine he was only pretending to work on. He wasn't fine. He kept circling back to the moment the old man at the counter had looked him dead in the eye and said something about a man wearing another man's medals. It shouldn't have bothered him. He'd swallowed worse insults from bigger men than Harold Jennings. But something in the old sailor's steady, unhurried certainty had lodged itself somewhere Griff didn't like visiting very often. His father's medals, his father's stories, the whole foundation of who he was built years ago at his father's knee, listening to tales of heroism and sacrifice he'd never once thought to question. Not once. Not in 45 years. But now, for the first time, a small and uncomfortable thought had started scratching at the edges of his mind. What if the stories hadn't been entirely true? He shook his head, angry at himself for even letting the thought take shape, and reached for another beer to drown it back down. We're heading back through Cedar Falls this week, he said suddenly, surprising even himself. Dutch looked up. Thought we already made our rounds there. We're going back, Griff said. Unfinished business. He didn't say what kind. He didn't fully know himself. Some part of him wanted to prove to himself as much as anybody else that the story he'd built his whole life around was still standing on solid ground. He had no idea he was about to ride straight into watching that ground give way beneath him. By mid-morning, Eleanor had made a phone call. She still kept in touch with a handful of old colleagues scattered across the country, retired now, most of them, though none of them any less sharp when it came to matters of service records and buried paperwork. She dialed an old friend named Walter Briggs, a retired records administrator who'd spent his career managing personnel files for the Department of the Navy. Walter, she said once the pleasantries were out of the way, I need a favor. For you, Eleanor, always. I need you to look up a name for me. Griffin Colton. Might also want to check his father, an Earl Colton. Spelling could be off. A pause settled on the other end. What am I looking for exactly? Service records, Eleanor said. Unit assignments? Anything that confirms actual time served? You think this fella's lying about something? I think, she said carefully, I've seen a lot of stolen valor in my career, Walter. And something about this man's medals doesn't sit right with me. Walter chuckled softly. You never could let a loose thread hang there, could you? Not once in 30 years, she said. Not planning to start now. She hung up and sat a long while in the quiet of her living room, watching the maple tree outside her front window sway in a wind she couldn't feel from where she sat. She had a feeling, the kind built from decades of experience, that Walter was going to call back with something that would change the whole shape of this story. She just didn't yet know how far that shape would stretch. That same afternoon, back at the Copper Spoon, Marlowe caught herself thinking about her father more than usual. It happened this way sometimes. A smell, a sound, A stranger's gesture would pull a memory up from somewhere she usually kept carefully closed. Today it was the sound of a motorcycle passing on the street outside, engine loud and rough, not so different from the sound she remembered from childhood, standing beside her father in the driveway while he worked on an old truck he never quite finished restoring. He used to hum while he worked. Some old tune she could never place anymore, the melody worn thin by time, the way melodies get when you're too young to write them down and too devastated later to ask anybody who might still remember it. Her father, Daniel Whitfield, had been a Navy SEAL for 11 years before she was born and 4 more after. She hadn't said the words out loud in a long while. Navy SEAL. They still felt almost too large for her mouth, too heavy with meaning, too likely to invite questions she wasn't always ready to answer. But something about yesterday, about Hal's gentle recognition, about the way this whole town seemed to be circling closer and closer to a truth she'd guarded so carefully, made her wonder if the season for careful silence was finally coming to an end. She remembered the night the 2 officers came to their door, her mother's hand gripping the doorframe so tight her knuckles had gone white. Being sent up to her room, 12 years old, confused, terrified, while the grown-ups spoke downstairs in careful, hushed tones she wasn't meant to understand. A training accident. A night jump gone wrong. Equipment failure, they'd said, though even at 12, something about the explanation had felt incomplete, like a sentence missing its final word. Her father had died doing something he'd done successfully 100 times before. Nobody had ever fully explained why that one night had turned out different. She pushed the memory back down gently, the way she'd learned to over the years, and returned to the rhythm of her work. 3 days left. The countdown had never once felt as loud as it did that afternoon. Hal came in for his usual coffee around 2, later than his normal morning visit, having spent the earlier hours at a doctor's appointment 2 towns over. He settled onto his stool with a small groan, the kind that comes from joints that have earned the right to complain. "Afternoon, Marlowe." "Afternoon, Hal. How'd the appointment go?" "About as well as appointments go at my age." He managed a small smile. "Doctor tells me I'm falling apart in all the usual places." She poured his coffee, smiling despite herself. There was something steadying in Hal's presence, something that made even a difficult day feel a little more manageable. "I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday," Hal said once she'd finished pouring. "About your father?" Her hands stilled on the counter. "I hope that's all right," he added quickly. "I don't mean to pry." "It's all right," she said softly. "I think I've kept it quiet so long it feels strange having somebody actually know." He nodded slowly, understanding, plain in his eyes. "You said he served 11 years before you were born, 4 more after?" She nodded. "That's a long career for special warfare," he said carefully. "Most men don't make it that far. The job takes too much out of a person, one way or another." "He loved it," she said quietly. "Even the hard parts, maybe especially the hard parts." Hal went quiet a moment, staring down into his cup. "I served alongside a few SEALs in my time," he said finally. "Different postings, different years. Good men, mostly. Carried themselves different from everybody else. Quiet. Never needed to prove a single thing to anybody." "That sounds like him," she said, her voice thickening. "The kind of man," Hal went on, "who wouldn't have thought twice about wearing that trident on his sleeve his whole life if it meant something to him. But he also wouldn't have needed to shout about it in a crowded diner just to feel like a man." She looked up at him, understanding exactly what he meant. "You're thinking about Colton again." "I am," he admitted. "Something about that man's whole presentation feels backwards to me. Real service doesn't usually announce itself that loud." "Eleanor thinks so too," Marlowe said. "She asked me about him this morning." Hal's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Eleanor Doyle? You know her?" "Everybody in this town knows Eleanor Doyle." A small smile crossed his face for the first time that afternoon. "Woman spent 30 years making sure people told the truth in courtrooms most folks never even knew existed. If she's looking into something, I'd wager she finds exactly what she's after." Something steady settled in Marlowe's chest at that something close to hope. For the first time since yesterday's humiliation, she felt like the ground beneath her wasn't quite so uncertain. She had no idea just how much steadier and how much shakier things were still about to become. That evening, Eleanor's phone rang. It was Walter calling back sooner than expected. "Eleanor?" he said, his voice carrying a tone she recognized right away, the tone of a man who'd found exactly what he was looking for and wasn't entirely comfortable with what it meant. "You found something?" "I found nothing," Walter said. "That's the thing. Searched every database I have access to. Griffin Colton. No service record at all. Never enlisted, never commissioned. Nothing." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, a familiar mix of vindication and disappointment settling through her. "And the father? Earl Colton?" A pause. "That one's different," Walter said slowly. "Earl Colton did serve, enlisted at 19, spent 6 years in the Navy before an early discharge." "What kind of discharge?" "General discharge," Walter said. "Not dishonorable, but not the kind of clean record a man usually brags about either. There's a note in the file referencing an internal investigation. Details are sealed, or at least not accessible through what I've got. Discharge came shortly after some kind of training incident." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "What year?" Walter read off a date. She sat very still, doing the math in her head. 21 years ago. The same year, if her memory of small-town gossip served her right, that Marlowe Whitfield's father had died in a training accident during a night jump. She didn't yet know if the two events were connected. Could easily be coincidence. The Navy was a vast organization, and training accidents, while rare, weren't unheard of. But 30 years of legal instinct told her that coincidences this specific rarely stayed coincidences for long. "Walter," she said carefully, "I need you to dig deeper. Whatever you can find on that incident. I've got a feeling this goes further than a man wearing medals he didn't earn." "I'll see what I can do," Walter said. "But, Eleanor, if this is what you think it might be, tread careful. Sealed investigations exist for a reason." "I understand," she said, "but sometimes the reason isn't a good one." She hung up and sat a long while in her living room, watching the last light of evening fade from gold to gray outside her window. Somewhere in this town, a young woman was carrying grief she'd never fully been allowed to understand. And somewhere buried in a sealed file from 21 years back, Eleanor suspected the truth about that grief was finally waiting to be found. She just didn't yet know how much pain it would carry along with it for everyone involved. 2 days remained. The morning arrived gray, and overcast clouds hanging low over Cedar Falls like the whole sky was holding its breath. Marlowe arrived at the diner at her usual time, moving through her routine with the same steady discipline she always carried, though something in her chest felt tighter than usual. Some quiet anticipation she couldn't quite put a name to. She didn't have to wait long to understand why. Around 11, the low growl of motorcycle engines rolled down Main Street again, the same sound that had announced trouble 2 days before. Diane looked up from the register, her face hardening at once. "Not again," she muttered. 5 bikes pulled up outside, and this time Griff didn't bother with even the thin pretense of politeness when he walked through the door. "Miss me?" he said, eyes finding Marlowe right away. The diner, comfortably full a moment before, went quiet, the way it had 2 days earlier. Conversations died. Forks paused halfway to mouths. "We're not looking for trouble," Diane said firmly, stepping out from behind the register. "You can eat somewhere else today." Griff smiled, a smile with nothing behind it. "Free country, ma'am," he said. "Diner's open. We'll take our usual booth." Diane's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, more unwilling to push this any further than she could control. Marlowe, standing near the coffee station, felt her pulse steady the way it always did when the room's tension rose. Years of quiet discipline, instilled by a father who'd taught her more about composure under pressure than most people learn in a lifetime, settled over her like a familiar coat. She would not give this man the satisfaction of watching her rattle. The iron serpents settled into their booth, louder and rowdier than before, clearly determined to make sure the whole diner knew they had arrived. Griff kept glancing toward Marlowe through the meal, something calculating behind his eyes that hadn't been there 2 days ago. Like he was hunting for a crack, some weakness he could use to reclaim the ground he felt he'd lost. Near the counter, an elderly woman sat quietly finishing her lunch. Her name was Constance Pruitt, 74 years old, a longtime widow whose late husband had spent decades of his life in the Navy before passing peacefully a few years back. Constance came in most days around noon, ordering the same tuna salad sandwich she'd ordered for years, sitting alone in her usual booth by the window. She'd witnessed the incident 2 days earlier from a distance, and something about the memory of it had left her rattled ever since. As the iron serpents grew louder, Constance quietly gathered her things, hoping to slip out before anything else escalated. But Griff, emboldened by whatever restless energy had been building in him for 2 days now, noticed her heading for the door. "Where are you off to in such a hurry, ma'am?" he called out, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Constance froze near the exit, hands tightening around her purse. "Just heading home," she said quietly. "No need to rush off." Griff stood, moving toward her with a false, exaggerated politeness that read far more threatening than open hostility would have. "We're just having a friendly meal." "I really should be going," she said, her voice thinner now. He stepped closer, close enough that she took an involuntary step back, bumping gently against the doorframe. "You scared of us?" he asked, tilting his head, mockery in his voice. "We don't bite, man, unless somebody gives us a reason to." A couple of his crew laughed from the booth, though the laughter came out strained, uneasy, the way laughter often does when it's covering discomfort rather than genuine amusement. Constance's eyes darted around the diner, searching for help, her composure beginning to crack under a fear she hadn't expected to feel at her age in a place she'd considered safe for years. That was the exact moment Marlowe set down the coffee pot she'd been holding. She crossed the diner floor with quiet, measured steps, the kind of movement that draws attention without asking for it. "Mrs. Pruitt," she said gently, positioning herself between Constance and Griff, without a hint of aggression, just presence, just calm authority. "I've got your check ready up front. Let's get you settled." Griff's eyes narrowed as Marlowe guided Constance a step to the side, angling her own body deliberately between the frightened older woman and the man looming over her. It looked effortless. It wasn't. Every part of that movement, the positioning, the calm redirect, the steady voice built to de-escalate rather than provoke, was something she'd absorbed years ago watching her father demonstrate crisis response in their own backyard. Something she'd studied further herself while preparing for her own future in service. "We were just talking," Griff said, irritation sharpening his voice, unhappy at having his moment interrupted. "I understand," Marlowe said evenly, "but Mrs. Pruitt's ready to head home now, and I'd like to help her do that." "I didn't ask for your help." "I know," she said. "I'm offering it anyway." Something in her tone, calm but immovable, made a couple of the men at Griff's booth shift uncomfortably in their seats. Griff stared at her a long moment, old wounded pride flaring behind his eyes. "You think you're something special," he said quietly, just for her. "Don't you?" "I think," she said just as quietly, "that a grown man threatening an elderly widow isn't something to be proud of. That's all I think." The words landed harder than a raised voice ever could have. His jaw tightened. For a moment, something dangerous flickered behind his expression, something that made the whole diner hold its breath together. Then, as fast as it appeared, it faded, replaced by a forced, bitter smile. "Whatever," he muttered, stepping back. "Wasn't worth the trouble anyway." He turned and walked back toward his booth, calling for the check in a voice that tried and failed to sound unbothered. Marlowe walked Constance outside all the way to her car, parked half a block down. "Thank you, dear," Constance said, hands still trembling as she fumbled for her keys. "I don't know what I would have done." "You did fine," Marlowe said softly. "You're all right now." Constance looked up at her, something searching in her face. "You handled that like somebody trained," she said. "The way you moved, the way you talked to him, that wasn't just instinct." Marlowe managed a small, tired smile. "My father taught me a few things growing up." He must have been quite a man. He was, she said simply. Constance studied her another moment, then reached out and patted her hand gently. My husband served 32 years, she said quietly. Retired a Master Chief. Used to say the truest measure of a person's strength wasn't how loud they could be, it was how gently they could handle something fragile. Marlowe felt her eyes sting unexpectedly at that. He sounds like he was a good man too, she said. He was, Constance said. And I think if he were here today, he'd have quite a lot to say about a man wearing medals he didn't earn, frightening old women in diners. She squeezed Marlowe's hand once more before climbing carefully into her car. Marlowe stood on the sidewalk a long moment after Constance drove off, watching the car disappear around the corner, feeling something settle inside her that felt almost like clarity. She'd spent so many years staying quiet, staying small, avoiding the kind of attention that came with revealing who she really was and what she carried. But standing there, on an ordinary sidewalk in an ordinary town, she understood something clearly for the first time. Quiet didn't mean weak. And sometimes protecting people who couldn't protect themselves was exactly what all that quiet training had been preparing her for all along. Back inside, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. The Iron Serpents finished their meal in tense, subdued silence, several of the men trading uneasy glances they thought Griff hadn't noticed. He noticed. He noticed everything that afternoon, and none of it sat well with him. He'd come into town looking to reclaim something, some sense of control that had slipped through his fingers 2 days earlier. Instead, he'd walked out having been quietly, calmly outmaneuvered by a waitress, half his size, in front of his own crew over an elderly woman he'd had no real reason to threaten in the first place. Something about the whole encounter gnawed at him as he climbed back onto his bike outside. He kept replaying the way Marlowe had moved, the calm, deliberate positioning, the steady voice that hadn't wavered once, even when he'd tried to intimidate her directly. That wasn't the reaction of somebody bluffing about a tattoo. That was the reaction of somebody who'd actually been trained. He didn't want to admit it, not even to himself, but some part of him had started believing, against his own stubborn resistance, that the tattoo on her arm might mean exactly what Old Man Jennings had suggested it meant. And if that was true, it meant Griff had spent 2 days publicly mocking something real, something earned, while wearing medals that had never once cost him a thing. The thought sat in his stomach like a stone the entire ride out of town. That night, Eleanor's phone rang again. It was Walter, and this time his voice carried none of the earlier hesitation, only a quiet, careful gravity. "Eleanor," he said, "I found the file. Tell me." "It's limited," Walter said. "Most of it's still sealed. But I managed to get my hands on a summary report from the incident 21 years ago. The training accident." Eleanor sat forward. "And Earl Colton was listed as a support technician on that exercise," Walter said, "responsible for equipment checks before the jump. There's an internal note questioning whether standard safety protocols were followed completely that night." Eleanor felt something cold settle over her. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that Earl Colton was connected to the equipment failure that killed Daniel Whitfield?" "I'm telling you," Walter said carefully, "that the file suggests an internal investigation looked into exactly that question. Findings were never made fully public. The official report blamed mechanical failure, plain and simple. But there's a handwritten note in the margins that reads, quoting directly here, 'insufficient diligence in pre-jump verification.'" Eleanor closed her eyes. 21 years. An entire family had carried a story about mechanical failure, an impersonal, faceless explanation for the worst night of their lives. And somewhere quietly buried in a sealed file, there had always been a name attached to that failure. Earl Colton, father of the very man who'd spent the last 2 days mocking the daughter of a man he may have helped kill. Eleanor sat in the silence of her living room a long while after the call ended, the weight of what she now knew pressing heavy against her chest. She thought about Marlowe, steady and quiet behind that diner counter, carrying grief she'd never been allowed to fully understand. And she thought about Griff wearing medals that weren't his, built entirely on a story that might be far more complicated and far more painful than he'd ever imagined. 2 days remained before Marlowe left Cedar Falls. Eleanor didn't yet know how or when or even if this truth should come to light. But she knew with the same certainty that had carried her through 30 years of courtrooms that truths like this one rarely stayed buried forever. Sooner or later, they always find their way to the surface. And when this one surfaced, she had a feeling the whole town of Cedar Falls was going to be standing there to witness it. Eleanor didn't sleep much that night. She lay awake watching the ceiling fan turn slowly overhead, running the same question through her mind over and over. How do you tell a young woman that the accident which took her father might not have been an accident at all? How do you hand someone grief they've already carried for 21 years and ask them to carry it a second time in a different shape? She thought about calling Marlowe right then, in the middle of the night, just to get it over with. But 30 years in courtrooms had taught her something important about timing. Truth delivered carelessly could do almost as much damage as no truth at all. So she waited for morning instead, turning the pieces over in her mind, searching for the gentlest way to hand someone something so heavy. Hal arrived at the diner earlier than usual the next day, driven by a restlessness he couldn't quite name. He found Eleanor already waiting in her usual booth, coffee untouched, newspaper unopened beside her. "You look like a woman who didn't sleep," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "I didn't," she admitted. She told him everything then, quietly, carefully, keeping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond their booth. The sealed file, the handwritten note, Earl Colton's name attached to the safety check that failed the night Daniel Whitfield died. Hal sat very still through the whole telling, weathered hands wrapped around a cup he never once lifted to his mouth. 21 years, he said finally, voice rough. That poor girl's been carrying a story that was never the whole truth. I know, Eleanor said. And Colton's boy has been walking around this whole time wearing his father's medals like a badge of honor. Hal went on, something hard settling into his voice now. Never earned a single one himself, building his whole life on a lie his father told to cover up something far worse. We don't know everything yet, Eleanor cautioned. The file's incomplete. I don't have full access to it. There could be more to the story. Maybe, Hal said. But you didn't call me over here at 7 in the morning because you think there's an innocent explanation. Eleanor was quiet a moment. No, she admitted. I called you because I don't know how to tell her, and I think you might be the right person to help me figure that out. Hal nodded, slowly understanding the weight of what she was asking. She trusts you, Eleanor said, more than she trusts most people in this town. If this truth needs to reach her gently, I think it needs to come through you. He was quiet a long moment, staring down at his still full cup. I served with men who didn't come home, he said eventually, his voice quieter now. I've had to sit with families before, try to find words for things that don't really have words. Never gets easier. But I'll do it, if that's what's needed. Not yet, Eleanor said. I want more before we say anything. I don't want to hand her half a truth and watch her carry the uncertainty on top of everything else. He nodded slowly. Then we wait. For now, she said, but not for long. She leaves in 2 days. Word of the incident with Constance spread through Cedar Falls faster than either Marlowe or Diane expected. By early afternoon, several regulars had stopped by just to check on things, drawn in by whispers of what had happened. A few offered quiet words of support as she moved through her shift. Others simply nodded at her with a kind of respect that hadn't quite been there before. Something had shifted in the way this small town looked at their quiet waitress. It wasn't loud. Small towns rarely announce a change of heart with fanfare, but it was there in the extra minute somebody spent thanking her for their coffee, in the way conversations quieted respectfully as she passed, no longer out of gossip, but out of something closer to admiration. Diane noticed it too. "You've got half this town looking at you different today," she said quietly during a lull in the afternoon rush. Marlowe managed a small, tired smile. "I didn't do anything special." "You stood between a bully and a defenseless old woman," Diane said. "In this town, that counts as plenty special." Marlowe said nothing to that, focusing instead on wiping down the counter, though something in her chest had loosened slightly at the words. For 3 years, she'd moved through Cedar Falls quietly, carefully, keeping enough distance that nobody thought to ask too many questions about the woman behind the uniform. Now, in the space of 2 days, that careful distance had begun dissolving, piece by piece, whether she was ready for it or not. Word of a different kind was spreading too, further out from Cedar Falls, along the roads and small towns, where a certain kind of community kept in closer touch than most people ever realized. A retired veterans motorcycle club calling themselves the Silver Eagles, most of them men and women in their 60s and 70s who'd served decades earlier and now spent their retirement riding together and looking out for one another, had a chapter 2 counties over. One of their members, a woman named Patricia Sullivan, had a niece who worked at the county hospital, the same niece who occasionally stopped into the Copper Spoon for breakfast before her shifts. She'd mentioned the story to her aunt, almost in passing. A young waitress with a hidden military connection, a biker gang leader wearing medals that didn't sit quite right, an old sailor who'd gone quiet after seeing a tattoo. Patricia hadn't thought much of it at first, but something about the description of those medals, the specific way they'd been described, nagged at her, the same way it had nagged at Eleanor. The Silver Eagles took matters of stolen valor seriously. Deadly seriously. Many of their members had served real time in real conflicts, watched friends not come home, spent years afterwards struggling with the true weight of what they'd carried. Men who borrowed that weight without ever paying its costs were, in their eyes, committing a particular kind of theft. Not just of medals, but of meaning. Patricia made a note to ask around about this Griff Colton character. She had a feeling, the kind built from years of paying close attention to the world around her, that this story wasn't finished yet. Griff Colton spent the rest of that day in a foul mood he couldn't quite explain to anyone, including himself. He kept returning in idle moments to the memory of Marlowe's calm voice standing between him and Constance Pruitt, to the steady, practiced way she'd moved, to the sinking, uncomfortable feeling that had settled into his stomach afterward. He tried drowning the feeling in the usual ways, drinking with his crew, bragging louder than usual about old stories, half of which he was no longer entirely sure were even true. But the discomfort followed him anyway, quiet and persistent, the way guilt does when it hasn't fully found its shape yet. That evening, sitting alone again in the garage behind the bar, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out an old photograph of his father tucked away in a battered wallet he rarely opened anymore. Earl Colton, young, smiling, standing in front of a military vehicle Griff had never bothered to ask much about. He stared at it a long time, turning his father's old stories over in his mind, searching for cracks he'd never let himself notice before. He thought about the way his father used to go quiet sometimes, late at night, staring at nothing, refusing to answer questions about certain years of his service. He'd always assumed that silence was pain, the normal expected weight of a man who'd seen difficult things. Now, for the first time, a colder possibility crept into his mind. What if the silence wasn't pain? What if it was guilt? He shoved the thought away hard, angry at himself for even considering it, and poured another drink. But some thoughts, once they take root, don't leave quietly, and this one had already begun to grow. On the evening before Marlowe's departure, Hal walked into the diner just before closing, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "Everything all right, Hal?" she asked, catching the tension in his shoulders right away. He hesitated, glancing toward Diane, who was finishing up the last of the closing tasks nearby. "Marlowe," he said carefully, "there's something Eleanor and I need to talk to you about. Something important." Something in his tone made her chest tighten instinctively. "Is it about my father?" she said quietly. It wasn't really a question. His silence was answer enough. "Can we sit?" he said gently. "This isn't something that should be said standing up." Diane quietly locked the front door and dimmed the last of the overhead lights, giving them the privacy the moment clearly needed. She didn't ask what it was about. Some instincts tell a person when to step back and let others carry something heavy on their own. Eleanor arrived a few minutes later, letting herself in through the back, her expression careful and measured. The same expression she must have worn 100 times before delivering difficult news in a courtroom. She sat down across from Marlowe and folded her hands together on the table. "I want you to know," she began gently, "that what I'm about to tell you isn't the whole picture yet. There are pieces still missing. But I think you deserve to know what we've found so far rather than let you leave town tomorrow without it." Marlowe nodded slowly, bracing herself. 21 years ago, Eleanor continued, there was an internal note attached to the investigation into your father's accident. A note questioning whether proper safety checks were followed that night. Her breath caught, but she said nothing, waiting. "The name attached to that note," Eleanor said carefully, "was a support technician responsible for pre-jump equipment verification, a young sailor named Earl Colton." For a long moment the diner sat utterly silent. Marlowe stared at Eleanor, then at Hal, processing the weight of what she'd just heard, watching the pieces of a story she'd carried incompletely for 21 years begin finally to take fuller shape. "Colton," she said quietly. As in Griff Colton's father," Hal confirmed gently. "Yes." She sat back slowly, one hand pressed lightly against her chest, feeling something enormous settle over her all at once. Grief and anger and a strange, aching kind of clarity all tangled together in a way she didn't yet have words for. "He mocked my father's memory," she said softly, almost to herself. "Standing right here, wearing medals his own father never should have worn either." "We don't know everything yet," Eleanor said gently, "but I promise you, Marlowe, I intend to find out the rest, whatever it takes." She nodded slowly, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though her voice, when she finally spoke again, stayed steady. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me, for not letting me leave town not knowing." Hal reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "you won't be facing it alone. This whole town's behind you now, whether you asked for it or not." Outside, the streetlights of Cedar Falls flickered on, one by one, against the darkening sky, the town settling quietly into evening, unaware of just how much was about to change before the sun rose again. Tomorrow, Marlowe was supposed to leave for training. She sat a moment longer, after Hal and Eleanor rose to go, staring down at her own hands on the table. Hands that had poured 1,000 cups of coffee in this diner without ever once shaking. They didn't shake now either. But something behind her calm had shifted permanently, the way a house settles after a storm nobody saw coming. 21 years she'd carried an explanation that never quite fit. A story about mechanical failure that left something unaccounted for every time she turned it over in her mind. Now she finally had a name to go with the gap. She didn't know yet what she'd do with it, whether the truth deserved to stay quiet a while longer, or whether it deserved better than that, deserved daylight, deserved a whole town finally understanding what real honor looked like against the false kind Griff Colton had been wearing on his chest for years. She only knew she wasn't leaving Cedar Falls carrying this alone anymore. And for the first time in longer than she could measure, that felt like something close to peace. She thought about the letter she'd need to write her mother eventually, once she had the words for it, once she understood herself, what this new piece of the story meant for the two of them. Her mother had rebuilt a life in the years since, remarried, moved on in the careful, practical way people do when staying still becomes unbearable. But some truths belonged to a daughter first, before they belonged to anyone else who'd loved the same man from a different angle. She thought, too, about the uniform waiting for her, 3 states away, folded and ready, the training that would ask everything of her, the way her father's training had once asked everything of him. She wondered if he'd known in his own final years of service how much of himself he was quietly handing down to a daughter who hadn't been born yet to receive it. Some things she was starting to understand get passed along whether a person means to pass them or not. A steadiness, a way of standing still under pressure. A tattoo worn quietly for 15 years that had somehow found its way tonight into becoming something far larger than she'd ever intended it to be. And somewhere across town, in a garage lit only by a single bare bulb, Griff Colton sat alone with an old photograph of his father, completely unaware that the truth he'd spent his whole life avoiding was already on its way to find him. One day remained. Cedar Falls woke that morning the same way it always did, mist curling off the river, diner lights flickering on one by one along Main Street. But underneath that ordinary surface, something had shifted overnight. The truth had begun moving through town. Quiet and unstoppable, the way water moves through cracks nobody notices until the whole foundation starts to give. Marlowe hadn't slept much. She'd spent most of the night by her window turning Eleanor's words over and over, trying to find a place to set them down. Her father's death had never been a simple story. She'd always known that somewhere underneath the official explanation. Now she finally understood why. She had one more shift at the Copper Spoon before she left Cedar Falls behind, at least for a while. One more day to close out a chapter of her life that had just grown far more complicated than she'd ever expected. She had no idea today would end up being the most important day of her life so far. Griff Colton hadn't slept either. He'd spent most of the night in that same dim garage, staring at his father's photograph, wrestling with a doubt he could no longer talk himself out of. By morning, that doubt had curdled into something else. Something he understood far better than doubt. Anger. He told himself the anger was about the waitress, about her comment standing between him and Constance Pruitt like she had any right to judge him. About the way this whole town had started looking at him different these past 2 days, like he was something they needed to be careful around. He didn't want to admit the anger was really about a photograph. About a father he'd worshipped his whole life and a small, cold whisper of doubt he couldn't shake about what that father might have actually done. Easier to be angry at somebody else. Easier to make this her fault. By 8 that morning, he'd made his decision. If this town wanted to turn against him, he'd give them a reason to remember exactly why they used to respect him. He climbed onto his bike and rode toward the sheriff's office, already rehearsing the story in his head. As he rode, an old memory drifted up uninvited. His father, on the porch some evenings, staring out at nothing, refusing to answer when Griff, just a boy then, asked simple questions about his years in the service. He remembered asking once, maybe 9 or 10 years old, what it felt like to be a hero. His father had gone quiet that evening, quieter than usual, and finally said only, "Heroes don't always feel like heroes, son. Sometimes they just feel tired." At the time, Griff had taken that for humility, the kind of modest, weathered wisdom heroes were supposed to carry. Now, riding toward the station with a lie forming on his tongue, that old memory sat differently in his chest. Heavier. Less like humility, more like a regret his father had never once fully explained. He pushed the thought away hard, the way he always did, and focused on the story ahead of him. Some habits built over 45 years take more than a bad feeling to break. Sheriff Wendell Boone had led the small Cedar Falls police force almost 20 years. Heavy-set late 50s, slow-moving but sharp-eyed, the kind of lawman who preferred quiet mediation over confrontation whenever he could manage it. He'd always carried a soft spot for veterans. His own father had served decades back, and Boone held on to a deep, old-fashioned respect for anybody who'd worn the uniform. That respect was exactly what Griff was counting on when he walked into the station that morning. "Sheriff," he said, adopting a carefully wounded tone, "I need to report something." Boone looked up from his paperwork. "What's going on, Griff?" "That waitress over at the diner. She threatened me yesterday, got right up in my face, said she'd hurt me if I didn't leave. My boys all saw it." Boone frowned. "That's not the story I've been hearing around town." "People believe what they want to believe," Griff said smoothly. "But I've got 4 witnesses who'll tell you the same thing I'm telling you." He wasn't lying about the witnesses. He'd spent the whole ride over making sure his crew understood exactly what version of events they'd be repeating. Boone studied him a long moment, an old, ingrained instinct telling him to trust the man in front of him simply because of the medals pinned to his jacket. It was a mistake plenty of good people in Cedar Falls had already made this week, and Boone was about to make it too. "I'll need to bring her in for questioning," he said slowly, "just to sort things out." "Appreciate it, Sheriff." Griff allowed himself a small, satisfied smile as he turned to leave. Man's got to trust the law's on his side. He walked out feeling, for the first time in 2 days, like he'd regained some small piece of control. He had no idea how quickly that control was about to slip through his fingers again. Marlowe was refilling coffee for the morning regulars when Boone walked through the diner door, his face apologetic but firm. "Marlowe," he said quietly, "I need you to come down to the station with me, just to talk through something." The diner went quiet around them the way it seemed to lately. "What's this about Wendell?" Diane asked sharply, stepping out from behind the counter. "Griff Colton's filed a complaint," Boone said. "Says Marlowe threatened him yesterday. I've got to look into it." "That's absurd," Diane said. "You know good and well what actually happened." "I know what I've heard," Boone said carefully, "but I've also got 4 witnesses backing his version. I have to treat it seriously, Diane. That's the job." Marlowe set down the coffee pot, hands steady despite the tightness building in her chest. "It's all right," she said quietly, though it wasn't, not really. "I'll come." Hal rose slowly from his stool, face hard. "This is nonsense, Wendell, and you know it." "Maybe," Boone admitted, "but nonsense still has to be sorted out proper. I'm sorry, Hal. I truly am." Marlowe untied her apron slowly, feeling every eye in the diner follow her toward the door. She had less than 24 hours before she was due to report for duty, and now, instead of preparing to leave Cedar Falls with her head held high, she was walking toward a police station to answer for a lie somebody else had told about her. The questioning at the station took almost 2 hours. Marlowe answered every question calmly, honestly, describing exactly what had happened the day before, word for word, gesture for gesture. Boone listened, comparing her account against the statements Griff's crew had given, statements suspiciously identical in phrasing, the kind of uniformity that usually means a story's been rehearsed rather than remembered. Still, without clear evidence either way, he found himself caught between an old habitual respect for a man wearing medals and a growing uneasy feeling that something about this whole complaint didn't sit right. "I'm going to need to hold on to this a little longer," he said finally, voice apologetic, "until I can sort out the discrepancies." "Am I under arrest?" she asked quietly. "No, not exactly. Just detained for now while I figure this out." She nodded slowly, though something cold had settled into her chest. He left her alone in the small back room, a modest space with a single table and 2 chairs, more waiting room than holding cell, though the weight of the situation made it feel far more confining than its size suggested. She sat quietly, hands folded, breathing slowly, the way she'd trained herself to do years ago whenever circumstances threatened to spiral beyond her control. She thought about her father again, about the calm, steady way he'd always spoken of difficult moments in his own service. He'd told her once, when she was young, that panic was a luxury a person couldn't always afford, that the mind worked best when the body stayed still, even when everything underneath was churning. She held on to that memory, letting it anchor her while the minutes stretched slowly by. Through the thin wall she could hear muffled voices, Boone on the phone with somebody, the low hum of the station's daily business continuing around her, indifferent to the way her entire future hung uncertain in the balance. She thought about the training waiting for her tomorrow, about the months of preparation, the paperwork, the quiet promises she'd made to herself about carrying her father's legacy forward the right way. She would not let this town's confusion take that from her. Whatever happened next, she intended to walk out of Cedar Falls with her head held high, the same way her father had taught her to carry herself through every difficult season of her life. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift briefly to a memory from childhood. Her father, kneeling in front of her the morning before one of his deployments, hands steady on her small shoulders. "Whatever happens," he'd told her. You keep your composure. Panic never solved a single problem in the history of the world. Calm always does. She'd been too young then to fully understand what he meant. Sitting in that back room years later, waiting for truth to catch up with the lies swirling around her, she finally understood it completely. Calm was not the absence of fear. It was choosing, again and again, not to let fear make your decisions for you. She thought about all the small, ordinary moments of the last 3 years that had led her to this room. The countless mornings she'd poured coffee before dawn without a single complaint. The way she'd learned this town's rhythms, its regulars, its quiet griefs and quieter joys, until Cedar Falls had become something closer to home than any place she'd lived since her father died. She hadn't set out to belong here. Belonging had simply happened, the slow way, it always does. Once a person stops watching the door for an exit and starts noticing the people around them instead. She breathed, slowly, steadily, and waited. Word of her detainment spread through Cedar Falls within the hour, carried by the same quiet, efficient network of small-town gossip that had carried every other piece of this story so far. Diane called Eleanor the moment Marlowe left the diner, her voice tight with worry. They're holding her, based on some story Colton's telling. That's ridiculous, Eleanor said immediately. I'll head over there now. There's something else, Diane added. The security camera, the one that would have shown exactly what happened yesterday with Mrs. Pruitt. It's not working. Footage from last night's just gone. Eleanor felt a cold certainty settle over her. That's not a coincidence. No, Diane agreed. I don't think it is either. Eleanor hung up and immediately called Hal, relaying the situation as calmly as she could manage, though urgency had crept into her voice despite her best effort. They tampered with the camera, Hal said, hardening. That's exactly the kind of thing a guilty man does when he's trying to control the story. Agreed, Eleanor said. But without that footage, we're relying entirely on witness testimony. And right now, Griff's got 4 voices to Marlowe's 1. Heavy silence on the line. We need more, Hal said finally. I know, Eleanor said. I'm working on it. The break came from somewhere neither of them expected. Beth Hargrove, a fellow waitress who'd worked alongside Marlowe almost 2 years, had been closing up the previous evening when the confrontation with Constance occurred. She'd been in the back at the time but had stepped out partway through, catching the last of the incident on her personal phone, filming almost by instinct after sensing something was wrong. She hadn't thought much of the footage in the moment, tucking her phone away and focusing on getting Constance settled instead. It wasn't until she heard about Marlowe's detainment that afternoon that she remembered the video, still sitting quietly in her phone. She watched it back with trembling hands, stomach tightening as she realized exactly what she was looking at. Clear as day, the footage showed Griff looming over Constance near the door, voice raised, body language threatening. It showed Marlowe stepping calmly between them, voice steady, words unmistakable. Nowhere in that footage was there any hint of the threat Griff had described to Sheriff Boone. Beth didn't hesitate. She grabbed her keys and drove straight to the station, video in hand, heart pounding the whole way. The drive took less than 10 minutes, though it felt considerably longer every red light along the way, testing her patience in a way ordinary traffic rarely did. She kept glancing at her phone on the passenger seat, half afraid the footage might somehow vanish before she got there, though she knew the fear made little sense. She thought about Marlowe as she drove about, the quiet, steady kindness she'd shown every single day they'd worked together, the way she always covered extra shifts without complaint, the way she never once spoke badly about difficult customers, even when she had every right to. Beth had always sensed there was something deeper beneath that calm exterior, some quiet strength she carried without ever explaining where it came from. Now, finally, she understood. She parked hastily outside the station, barely bothering to straighten the car, and hurried inside, phone clutched in her hand. Boone watched the footage twice, his expression growing darker with each replay. This isn't what Griff described at all, he said quietly. No, Beth said firmly, it's not. He rubbed a hand across his tired face, feeling the weight of a mistake he'd nearly let himself make. I owe Marlowe an apology, he said, a real one. You can start by letting her go. He was already moving toward the back room before she'd finished the sentence. He found the 4 bikers who'd corroborated Griff's story waiting in the front room, still repeating the same rehearsed phrases to each other under their breath the way people do when they're trying to keep a story straight, rather than simply remembering it. Boone studied them a long moment. "I've got footage," he said plainly, "that doesn't match a word of what you all told me this morning." Dutch was the first to look away. "Anybody want to reconsider their statement before this goes any further?" Boone asked. Nobody answered right away, but something in the silence had changed. The confident uniformity from that morning had cracked each man, suddenly aware that his story was the only thing standing between himself and a charge of his own. "I might have gotten some of it wrong," Dutch said, finally, quietly. "Wasn't really looking the whole time." Boone nodded slowly, unsurprised. He'd seen this exact unraveling more times than he could count over 20 years wearing the badge. Loyalty built on fear rarely held up once the fear stopped making sense. Marlowe stepped out a few minutes later, blinking against the afternoon light streaming through the station's front windows. "I'm sorry," Boone said immediately, voice heavy with genuine regret. "I let old habits cloud my judgment. Wasn't fair to you." "Thank you for looking into it properly," she said, exhaustion plain in her voice, though relief had begun loosening the tightness in her chest. "There's more," Boone said carefully. "Eleanor Doyle's outside, says she's got something else you need to hear about Colton." Her stomach tightened again, this time from anticipation rather than fear. She stepped outside to find Eleanor and Hal waiting on the sidewalk, along with several familiar faces from the diner and a few unfamiliar ones, including a small group of older men and women in matching leather vests marked with a silver eagle insignia. "Marlowe," Eleanor said, stepping forward. "We've confirmed everything now, with real documentation this time, and there's something happening tonight I think you'll want to be part of." The Silver Eagles, it turned out, had been quietly investigating Griff Colton for the better part of 2 days, ever since Patricia Sullivan had first heard whispers of his suspicious metals. Their inquiries, combined with Eleanor's legal contacts, had produced far more than the sealed file summary Walter had originally uncovered. A retired records clerk in their network had managed to access additional documentation confirming everything Eleanor had already suspected. Earl Colton had indeed been responsible for the equipment failure that led to Daniel Whitfield's death 21 years earlier. The internal investigation had quietly recommended disciplinary action, but the case had been resolved through an early general discharge, instead a resolution that avoided public scandal but left the full truth buried for over 2 decades. Griff Colton, meanwhile, had never served a single day in any branch of the military. Every medal on his jacket had been purchased online piece by piece over the course of several years, an entire manufactured identity built on top of his father's carefully hidden shame. "He's built his whole life on a lie," Patricia said quietly, standing beside Eleanor on the sidewalk. "Wearing honor he never earned, mocking someone who actually understands what real sacrifice costs." Marlowe already knew the hardest part, the part about Earl Colton and the night her father died. Hal and Eleanor had given her that weight to carry the evening before, but this was different. Hearing it laid out with paperwork, with names and dates, and a records clerk's careful signature made it feel less like private grief and more like a fact the whole world could finally see. And the part about Griff himself, that he'd never served a single day, that part was new. She felt something complicated settle over her at that. Not quite triumph, not quite anger, something closer to a strange, aching clarity. "What happens now?" she asked. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Patricia. "Tonight's the town's annual Veterans Appreciation Dinner," Eleanor said. "Held at the community hall. Griff was actually scheduled to receive a small recognition this year, arranged months ago by people who had no idea what he really was. We think," Patricia added, "tonight's exactly the right time and place for the truth to come out, publicly, properly, with the whole town watching." Marlowe felt her pulse quicken. "I leave for training tomorrow morning," she said quietly. "I know," Eleanor said gently. which is exactly why I think you deserve to leave this town with the truth fully settled, instead of carrying more unfinished business behind you. Marlowe looked around at the small group gathered on the sidewalk, at Hal's steady presence, at Eleanor's quiet determination, at the unfamiliar but somehow already familiar faces of the Silver Eagles standing shoulder to shoulder in solidarity. For the first time in a very long while, she didn't feel like she was carrying any of this alone. "All right," she said softly. "Let's finish this properly." The Cedar Falls Community Hall filled up quickly that evening, tables decorated with small flags, a modest banner strung across the front reading, "Veterans Appreciation Dinner," in careful hand-painted letters. It was a tradition the town had kept alive for over 30 years, an evening set aside to honor the men and women who'd served, complete with a simple dinner, a few short speeches, and small tokens of recognition handed out by the mayor. Griff arrived early, dressed in his usual jacket, medals polished for the occasion, clearly expecting to be called up during the recognition portion of the evening. He had no idea what was waiting for him. Marlowe arrived a little later, dressed simply, her sleeve pushed up deliberately this time, the trident tattoo visible for anybody who cared to look. Hal walked in beside her. Eleanor followed shortly after alongside Diane and Beth, and trailing behind them, quiet but unmistakably present, came a dozen members of the Silver Eagles, leather vests marked with the same silver insignia, their presence alone drawing curious glances from around the room. Griff noticed them right away, something uneasy flickering behind his eyes. He told himself it meant nothing. He was wrong. Not everyone in the Iron Serpents felt entirely comfortable with how the last 2 days had gone. Dutch, in particular, had grown quieter than usual, watching his president with the wary attention of a man who sensed the ground shifting beneath a story he'd believed his whole time riding with the club. He'd never questioned Griff's father much. Why would he? The stories had always been consistent, delivered with the same practiced weight, the same careful details that made a listener feel like they were being let in on something private. But sitting at that table now, watching Griff's hands shake slightly as he touched his medals, Dutch found himself wondering for the first time in years whether he'd ever actually seen any proof. A discharge paper. A photograph in uniform doing something more specific than standing in front of a vehicle. Anything beyond the stories themselves. He kept his doubts to himself for now. But he watched the Silver Eagles gathered near the back wall with a different kind of attention than the rest of his crew. Less hostile, more curious, like a man beginning to suspect he'd been standing on the wrong side of something without ever meaning to. Marlowe found a quiet seat near the back, Hal settling in beside her, Diane and Beth just across the table. She watched the room fill slowly around her familiar faces from years of pouring coffee and clearing plates, people who'd known her only as the polite, quiet waitress from the Copper Spoon, never once suspecting the weight of the story she carried. Tonight, for the first time, she felt ready to let that weight be seen. Her hands trembled slightly under the table, not from fear exactly, but from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of stepping fully into a truth she'd spent 15 years keeping carefully hidden. Hal noticed, reaching over to give her hand a steady, reassuring squeeze. "Whatever happens tonight," he said quietly, "you don't have to say a single word if you don't want to. Eleanor's got this handled." "I want to," Marlowe said softly. "I think I'm finally ready to." He nodded, understanding settling gently into his weathered features. Across the room, Griff sat rigid at his table, glancing every so often toward the small cluster of Silver Eagles near the back wall. Their calm, steady presence unsettling him more with each passing minute. He kept touching the medals on his jacket absent-mindedly as though reassuring himself they were still there, still real. Still enough to carry him through whatever was coming. They weren't. The evening began normally enough. The mayor offered a few opening remarks, a local pastor said a brief blessing over the meal, plates passed around, conversation rising and falling in warm, familiar patterns. But as the meal wound down and the recognition portion of the evening approached, Eleanor rose quietly from her seat and made her way toward the small podium at the front of the hall. "Mayor," she said politely, "if you don't mind, I have something important to share with everyone this evening before recognitions begin." The mayor, a little surprised, but recognizing Eleanor's standing in the community, nodded and stepped aside. Eleanor turned to face the room, her expression calm, measured, carrying the same quiet authority she'd carried through 30 years of courtrooms. "Tonight," she began, "we're here to honor real service, real sacrifice. And I think it's important on an evening like this that we make sure the honors we give are given to those who've actually earned them." A murmur rippled through the room. Griff sat frozen at his table, stomach dropping. "Several days ago," Eleanor continued, "a young woman in this town was publicly humiliated, mocked for a tattoo she carries in honor of her father, a Navy SEAL, who gave his life in service to this country 21 years ago." She gestured gently toward Marlowe, who rose slowly from her seat, chin, steady sleeves still pushed up. A wave of recognition moved through the room. Several people who'd only heard whispers of the story now watched with fresh understanding. "That young woman," Eleanor continued, "is Marlowe Whitfield, daughter of Chief Petty Officer Daniel Whitfield. Tomorrow morning she reports for her own service, following in her father's footsteps as a United States Navy corpsman." A quiet ripple of applause began, warm and genuine, growing steadily as the room absorbed the weight of what they were hearing. Marlowe felt her eyes sting, overwhelmed by the sudden, gentle warmth of an entire room turning toward her with a respect she'd spent 15 years avoiding. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "The man who mocked her that day," she continued, voice hardening slightly, "is sitting in this room tonight, wearing medals he never earned." Every head in the room turned toward Griff. His face had gone pale, hands gripping the edge of the table. "That's a lie," he said, voice cracking despite his effort to sound confident. "I've served this country. Everybody here knows that." "Have you?" Eleanor said calmly. "Because according to official Navy records, Griffin Colton has never enlisted in any branch of the United States military. Not once, not ever." Gasps moved through the room, quiet at first, then rising. "That's not true," Griff said, standing now, voice louder, more desperate. Patricia rose from her seat among the silver eagles. "We checked, son," she said, not unkindly, but firmly. "Every medal on that jacket was purchased online. We've got the documentation." His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, finding only silence and slowly hardening expressions instead. "My father served," he said, voice smaller now. "I grew up hearing his stories." "Your father did serve," Eleanor said, gentler now. 6 years before an early discharge. But Griff, there's more to that story than you were ever told." The room went utterly silent. 21 years ago," Eleanor continued, "your father was responsible for pre-jump equipment verification on a training exercise. An internal investigation found that safety protocols weren't properly followed that night. That failure cost a man his life." Griff shook his head slowly, disbelief written across his face. "That man," Eleanor said quietly, "was Daniel Whitfield, Marlowe's father." The silence that followed stretched on and on. Griff turned slowly, eyes finding Marlowe across the room, something breaking visibly behind his expression. "That's not possible," he whispered. "I understand this is a lot to hear all at once," Eleanor said, softening further. "And I want to be clear, Griff. What your father did or didn't do that night isn't something you're responsible for. You were a child. You didn't cause that accident." She paused, letting the words settle. "But you've spent years building an identity on medals you never earned, mocking people who actually understand the true cost of service. That part you are responsible for." Griff stood frozen, the weight of the entire room pressing down on him, the foundation of everything he'd built his identity on, crumbling in real time in front of everyone he knew. Marlowe stepped forward then, quietly, moving toward the front of the room until she stood only a few feet from him. The room held its breath. "I'm not here to humiliate you," she said, voice steady, carrying easily through the silent hall. "I know what it feels like to carry grief about a father you barely got to understand. I've carried that my whole life." Griff's eyes had gone wet, all his earlier bravado gone. "But my father earned every single thing people said about him," she continued. He earned it through years of sacrifice, through discipline, through choosing something larger than himself over and over, even when it cost him everything. She let her words breathe a moment. Wearing medals you didn't earn doesn't just lie to other people, Griff, it lies to yourself too. It keeps you from ever having to become the kind of man those medals are supposed to represent. The room stayed utterly silent, hanging on every word. Griff lowered his eyes, hands trembling slightly as he reached up and unpinned the medals from his jacket, one by one, setting them down carefully on the table in front of him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, barely audible, "for what I did to you. For all of it." Marlowe studied him a long moment. "I believe you," she said finally, "and I hope someday you find a way to earn honor of your own. The real kind. The kind that doesn't need medals to prove itself." The room stayed quiet a long moment after that, the weight of everything settling gently over the gathered crowd. Then slowly, somebody began clapping. Then another. Then the entire room rose together, applause building steadily, warm and genuine, directed not at spectacle but at the quiet courage of a young woman who'd carried grief silently for 15 years and had finally been allowed in front of her whole community to set some part of that weight down. Hal moved forward through the crowd, standing beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Your father," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, "was one of the finest men this country ever produced. And standing here tonight, I don't think there's a single person in this room who doubts his daughter carries that same measure of honor." The applause rose again, warmer still. Boone approached quietly from the back, addressing Griff in a measured, serious tone. "Impersonating military service and filing a false report are both serious offenses," he said. "We'll need to discuss what happens next, Griff. Formally." Griff nodded slowly, the anger finally drained out of him, replaced by something closer to exhausted acceptance. "I understand," he said quietly. Around the room, small conversations rose softly, neighbors turning to each other, some wiping tears away, others sitting in thoughtful silence, absorbing everything they'd just witnessed. An elderly man near the front, a Korean War veteran named Ferguson, who rarely spoke much at these gatherings, rose slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. "In all my years," he said, voice carrying clear despite its frailty, "I don't think I've seen a truer example of what real service looks like than what I just watched in this room tonight." He turned toward Marlowe, offering a slow, respectful nod. "Your father would be mighty proud, young lady, and so should you be, of yourself." Marlowe felt fresh tears gather, overwhelmed by the steady warmth radiating from every corner of the hall. Diane moved through the crowd, wrapping her in a tight, motherly embrace. "I've watched you carry yourself with quiet grace for 3 years, she whispered against her shoulder. "I always knew there was something remarkable underneath that steady calm of yours." "Thank you for giving me a place to belong," Marlowe whispered back, "even before you knew the whole story." "That's what family does," Diane said simply. Across the room, an older woman Marlowe didn't recognize approached slowly, leaning on a cane of her own. She introduced herself as a widow of a Navy corpsman, one of the very few who'd served in that same role decades before women were fully welcomed into it. "I heard what you're training to become," the woman said, taking Marlowe's hand in both of hers. "There aren't many of us who understand what that job really costs. You hold people together when everything else is falling apart around them. It's not the kind of thing they put on recruiting posters." "I know it won't be easy," Marlowe said. "No," the woman agreed, "but you already know something most people your age never learn in time. You know how to stay steady when the room around you isn't. That's most of the job, really. The rest, they'll teach you." She squeezed Marlowe's hand once more before shuffling off to rejoin her family at a nearby table, leaving Marlowe with a warmth she hadn't expected from a stranger. The particular kind of warmth that comes from being recognized by somebody who has actually walked the road ahead of you. Later that evening, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Marlowe found herself standing outside the community hall, the cool night air settling gently around her. Hal joined her a few minutes later, along with Eleanor, Diane, and Beth, the small group gathering under the soft glow of the streetlights. "Tomorrow's a big day," Diane said, voice thick with emotion she wasn't quite managing to hide. "It is," Marlowe agreed softly. "Your father would be proud," Hal said. "Not just of your service, of the way you carried yourself through all of this. That's harder to teach than discipline. That's character." Marlowe felt tears finally slip free, warm against the cool night air. "Thank you," she said quietly. "All of you. I spent so long thinking I had to carry this alone." "Not anymore," Eleanor said gently. "This town's got your back now, whether you're here or 3 states away." Patricia approached from where the Silver Eagles had gathered near their bikes, expression warm. "We'd be honored," she said, "to escort you out of town tomorrow morning, if you'll have us." Something swelled warmly in Marlowe's chest at the offer. "I'd like that very much," she said. Patricia smiled, the kind of smile carrying decades of hard-won wisdom behind it. "Your father's story reminds me a lot of my own husband's," she said. "He never talked much about what he'd done overseas either. Used to say the ones who talk loudest about their service are usually the ones who understand it least." Marlowe nodded, a quiet kinship settling over the small group beneath the streetlights. "I think Cedar Falls needed this reminder," Eleanor added, "about what real honor actually looks like. Sometimes a town forgets until something forces it to remember." "Well," Diane said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, "consider us reminded." A soft round of tired, warm laughter moved through the group, the first real laughter any of them had shared in days, cutting gently through the heaviness of everything that had come before. The next morning arrived clear and bright. The kind of morning that seems to promise something good is coming. Marlowe packed her small bag carefully, taking one last look around the modest apartment that had been home for 3 quiet years. She dressed simply, sleeve pushed up deliberately, the tattoo visible without hesitation for the first time in 15 years. When she stepped outside, she found nearly the entire town gathered along Main Street, spilling out from the diner, from the shops, from front porches, up and down the block. Diane stood near the front of the crowd, tears streaming freely down her face. Hal stood beside her, his old posture straighter than usual, pride evident in every line of his weathered face. Eleanor stood nearby, a rare, warm smile softening her usually sharp expression. Beth waved enthusiastically from beside the diner's front window. And lined up along the street, engines idling low and respectful rather than loud and aggressive, sat a dozen members of the Silver Eagles, ready to escort her out of town. Marlowe walked slowly through the gathered crowd, overwhelmed by the warmth surrounding her, pausing every few steps to accept a handshake, a hug, a quiet word of gratitude and pride. When she reached her car parked at the edge of town, she turned back one final time to look at the community that had, in the space of just a few short days, transformed from strangers into something closer to family. "Thank you," she called out, voice carrying clearly across the quiet morning street, "for seeing me. All of me." The crowd erupted into warm applause waves and cheers, rising together into the bright morning air. As Marlowe pulled out of Cedar Falls, the Silver Eagles fell into formation around her car, engines humming low and steady, escorting her all the way to the county line. At the town's edge, they slowed together, forming a respectful line on either side of the road as she passed through, engines revving once in a unified salute before falling quiet again. She watched them fade in her rearview mirror, chest tight with an emotion she didn't fully have words for. Gratitude, grief, pride, all of it tangled together into something that felt finally like peace. She thought about her father, about the promise she'd made 15 years ago in that small tattoo shop 3 states away. She'd carried him quietly for so long, hidden beneath long sleeves and careful silence. Now, driving toward a future built in his honor, she understood something clearly for the first time. Honor was never meant to be worn loudly. It was meant to be lived the way her father had lived it, quietly, faithfully, for the right reasons, whether anybody was watching or not. She thought about the version of herself who'd walked into Cedar Falls 3 years earlier, careful and closed off, determined to let nobody get close enough to ask the wrong questions. That version of her had needed the quiet, had needed the long sleeves and the careful answers and the distance she kept from nearly everyone she met. She wasn't sure that version of her would recognize the woman driving away this morning, sleeve pushed up a whole town, waving her off like family. But she thought her father would have. He'd always said the bravest thing a person could do wasn't hiding what they'd survived. It was letting people see it and trusting them to hold it with the same care she had. Cedar Falls had proven him right. Back in Cedar Falls, life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. The Copper Spoon reopened for its usual morning rush coffee, brewing, bacon sizzling, the bell above the door jingling with each new customer. But something in the town had changed for good. People spoke a little more carefully now about judging others based on appearances alone. Regulars at the diner made a point of thanking veterans they recognized, the real and humble ones, the kind who rarely spoke about their service unless directly asked. Even people who'd only heard the story secondhand from a neighbor or a cousin passing through seemed to understand something about it that stuck with them. Griff faced legal consequences for his false report and his years of stolen valor. But the town, in a show of the same grace Marlowe had extended him that night, gave him room to slowly begin rebuilding an honest life, one small choice at a time. Dutch, for his part, left the Iron Serpents within the month. Nobody in Cedar Falls heard much about where he went, only that he'd started riding alone, and that a few people who ran into him on the road said he seemed like a quieter man than the one they remembered. Hal kept his same seat at the counter every morning. When newcomers asked about the small framed photograph Diane had hung near the register, a young Navy chief petty officer smiling beside his daughter, Hal was always the first to tell them the story. Not loudly, just steady and honest and true. Months later, a letter arrived at the Copper Spoon, addressed to the whole diner staff. Marlowe wrote about her training, about the discipline she'd found in continuing her father's legacy, about how often she thought of the town that had finally let her set down a burden she'd carried alone for far too long. She wrote, too, about the friendships she'd made in her unit, young men and women who reminded her in small ways of the community she'd left behind in Cedar Falls. Diane read it aloud to the regulars one quiet morning, her voice thick with pride. Near the end, Marlowe had written a single line that Diane later kept pinned above the register for years to come. "Some people wear their honor loudly. I'd rather live mine the way he did, quietly and for the right reasons." That was the lesson Cedar Falls needed most. Not a lesson about medals or motorcycles or who could shout the loudest in a diner. A lesson about who to trust and who to truly actually see. A lesson some folks said worth passing down the same way Marlowe's father had passed his own quiet strength on to her. Because the people carrying the heaviest things rarely announce it. They just keep showing up, keep pouring the coffee, keep being kind, long after most folks would have given up trying. So the next time you meet somebody quiet, somebody easy to overlook, remember Marlowe Whitfield and the father she carried on her skin for 15 years before anybody else ever knew his name. Real strength rarely needs to shout. It only needs to keep quietly, steadily standing. Some stories end with a victory parade. This one ended with a woman driving quietly out of town before sunrise, sleeve pushed up, carrying her father forward the only way she'd ever really needed to. Not loudly, just steadily, one honest mile at a time. Thank you for spending this time with her story today. If it moved you even a little, we hope you'll carry a small piece of that same quiet strength into your own life.